have in a virtual way our friend Günter Figal, Professor Günter Figal, waiting for having it again in a not virtual way, in a real presence way, and Vorhandenheit and Zuhandenheit way in Turin, as it happened about 3 years ago, if I remember well, who gave a memorable class in Turin. And we all are reminiscent of his presence and the presence of his wife, Antonia Hegel, without the H, who is a philosopher as well. And we all send our greets to Antonia too. Günter was the author of more than 10 books, and he was a professor in Tübingen, and then from the beginning of the new century, 2001, he was professor in Freiburg. And to be professor in Freiburg is something special, peculiar in the German philosophy, because it relies to a line which include some figures like Husserl, Heidegger, and Figal. And note, there is of course a series of transformation in this genealogy, but I believe that what is interesting in this genealogy is that experience and wise-eyed are able to correct the mistake of some moment. I mean, you know that at the very beginning, Husserl was a realist. Then he became an idealist. Then Heidegger became much more than an idealist. And Günther, starting from Heidegger and Gadamer, came back to the realism. And then it's also historically relevant that is coming back to Freiburg, coincided with the publication of his monumental work Gegenständlichkeit. We can call him Thinklichkeit, Englishkeit. I don't know how express exactly this concept, because it's not just objectivity, say objectuality. We discussed once a possible translation of Gegenständlichkeit, and therefore this shows, so to speak, a kind of experience that we, from a more provincial point of view, experienced in Turin, because in Turin happened the same thing, from realism then to hyper idealism and back to realism, and this shows that philosophy has some kind of coherence, and there is also a lot of important features in public intellectual scene that Günter had, especially, which is very important, is the editor of the International Yearbook for Hermeneutics, which is the most important yearbook on hermeneutics, and also is the way of a renewal of this discipline right now. But this is enough for not for Günter, but for me. And I give the floor to Tiziana, and I enjoy first of hearing you this afternoon, then of seeing you and in more sein und Zeit way in Turin. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Maurizio. I want just to remember the title of the talk. It's Objective Aesthetics on the Epistemological Relevance of Art. About 40-45 minutes for the presentation, and then we will have the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you, and especially Tiziana for the brief announcement now, and to you and Maurizio for the invitation, and especially Maurizio for your introduction of my work. It's a really great pleasure for me to be at least virtually in Torino again, because I spent a very productive and interesting and stimulating time there, which I enjoyed very much together with my wife. And it's a great pleasure to be in dialogue in this way. And what I have decided to do today is a kind of presentation of my recent work. This work has concentrated in a certain way on aesthetics, and what has been interesting to me is especially, yes, what the title says, objective aesthetics. That means to consider the possibilities of a realist conception of art. Let me start with a brief overview. My intention in the following is a reconsideration of philosophical aesthetics. In order to achieve this, I will first discuss philosophical aesthetics in contrast to what I will introduce as philosophy of art. I will show why I take aesthetics as the better way to philosophically deal with art, and then give an outline of how artworks can be aesthetically conceived. By the way, philosophy of art, as you will see in the way I introduce it, is a very special endeavor. It doesn't cover everything that could be called philosophy of art. Thereafter, I wish to clarify why the aesthetic experience of artworks should not be regarded as a kind of luxury leisure time program, but rather as a chance of discovering an essential aspect of human life. Or more precisely, I wish to show that artworks are representatives as such, representatives of the life world. However, they can be such representatives only as abstractions from the context of everyday life. To this effect, they should be understood, as I would argue, in parallel to science. Art and science, this is my last point, followed only by some concluding remarks, are reverse but complementary discoveries of objectivity. So often, my first point, often, if not mostly, aesthetics is regarded as a philosophical endeavor far less important than, for instance, epistemology or ethics. There is good reason to regard this as strange, especially when considering that Kant understood his critique of the power of judgment as the keystone of his critical philosophy. However, not at least Kant himself is jointly responsible for the marginalization of aesthetics, stressing the merely subjective character of aesthetic experience, but also indirectly conceding that such experience is related to objects. He encouraged or even provoked questions concerning the very character of such objects. The problem was widely, but not always clearly discussed, and perhaps because of that, the discussion equaled to a momentous shift. With the most important responses to the open question in Kant's discussion of aesthetic experience, aesthetics was turned into what I would like to call philosophy of art. Regarded in the new context, artworks were supposed to incorporate truth. And it had to be a very specific kind of truth, because artworks, as is well known, are not true and cannot be true in the same way as propositions. Philosophers of art, such as Hegel, and following him Heidegger, Gadamer, and Adorno, offer quite different answers to the question of how to conceive the specific truth of artworks more in detail. These answers, however, coincide insofar as they all problematize or marginalize the aesthetic character of artworks. Though they are meant to grasp artworks in their objectivity, they place artworks in contexts, cultural, historical, or ethical, and thus determine them in a way that is more specific for the respective answers than for artworks as such. The truth that philosophies of art are arguing for is a truth more philosophical than artistic, and depending on a particular philosophy, the supposed truth of art varies remarkably. For Hegel, to cut a long story short, art is true as a manifestation of spirit. For Heidegger, as the opening of a new national and especially German historic world. For Gadamer, art is true as a representation of religious and ethical life, and finally for Adorno as disclosure of a non-identical nature. Owing to the variety of artistic truths, not every artwork does meet the claim of every particular philosophy. Rather, every particular philosophy of art favors its own leading examples and thus excludes infinitely many works, the artistic character of which cannot be seriously doubted. None of these philosophies does cover art in general and thus allow for the existing rich variety of artworks, which are a challenge as well as a pleasure to aesthetic experience. So how to deal with the problem of aesthetic objectivity in sight of such unsatisfying solutions? What suggests itself is a step back to Kant, nota bene not in order to affirm his idea of aesthetic experience as merely subjective, but rather in order to discover the objectivity inherent in the experience he describes. Aesthetic experience has a correlate. It essentially refers to something that is experienced aesthetically, something beautiful, either natural or a work of art. Following Kant's assumption that such experience is merely contemplative, without any practical interest, and also not bound to any conceptual determination, one has good reason to take the aesthetic character of such experience literally. Aesthetic experience then is perceptional, and not by chance designated by a term deriving from the Greek word for perception, namely aesthesis. However, the term is normally not used in the trivial meaning according to which every perceptual experience could be called aesthetical. Rather, the perceptual character of an aesthetic experience referring to something beautiful must be special. And because its difference from normal perceptions cannot be that of a different kind, as if aesthetic experience would be based on special senses, capacities, or dispositions, it must be a modification of normal perception-based experience, and that presumably as an intensification of normal perception. Contemplating something beautiful, one would perceive more attentively and more intensely. Moreover, it is very unlikely that such attentiveness and intensity would be at random, as if it were an attitude that could arbitrarily be adopted. Even if every object could be contemplated aesthetically, there are objects that require to be experienced in that way, and even motivate contemplators to adopt an aesthetic attitude. Such things are beautiful things, and most prominently artworks. Such works are made for aesthetic contemplation and presupposed one is not ignorant of beauty. Facing an artwork, one involuntarily would contemplate it aesthetically. Artworks can only motivate aesthetic experience and thereby prove to be aesthetic objects if they differ in character from normal objects. As Kant has already emphasized, they resist practical interests, or at least cannot be reduced to conforming to practical interests. They also must withdraw from conceptual determination, or at least have decisive qualities that cannot be conceptually determined. Or, to unite these two aspects, aesthetic objects must be devoid of a meaning of whatever kind, under which they could be subsumed. Though meaningful objects in general are perceptible, their perceptibility mostly is not realized, but supposed by their meaning, but superposed by their meaning. They are perceived only in order to be identified as meaningful and to be subsumed to a meaning that never is exclusively their own. In contrast, aesthetic objects are radically individual. Insofar as they are regarded aesthetically, they are not taken as instances of a generally identifiable meaning. However, both identification and aesthetic experience normally coincide regarding the same object. An object may, for instance, be identified as an oil painting by Paul Cézanne, but this is without any significant relevance for aesthetic contemplation. Aesthetically relevant is nothing but the picture's visible surface, the mere interplay of colors, lines, and forms in their unique visibility. The foregoing brief characterization of artworks as aesthetic objects may appear as plausible. Artworks indeed may be devoid of a practical or communicative meaning, and thus be simply what they are, or, in a word, be simple. Moreover, there may be individuals, the structure of which is experienced as a mere interplay without any organizing principle, and thus may be called decentered, so that there would be primarily and evidently perceptible without any conceptual presupposition. However, all this does not sufficiently explain the experience of artworks. As could be described more in detail, such experience is neither merely emotional, nor is it a kind of recognition, but a unique fusion of insight and pleasure, an insight that can, at least to a certain degree, be explicated and reflected, although not verified, and a kind of pleasure that is not primarily a subjective emotion, but an immediate affirmation of a subject matter, namely of the respective work of art. An experience so unique in character must reveal something essential and important. Otherwise, it would surely be less attractive than it factually is. For an explanation of its unique importance, one can refer to the eminent aesthetic character of artworks. As objects of intensified perceptibility, they emphasize the basic perceptibility of everything intelligible, and thus set free what normally is superposed by the web of meaning. As objects, they are not determined by any cognitive interest. Artworks can reveal the ground of every cognition. They are, to take up a term of Husserl's, representatives of the life world, which, according to Husserl, is, I quote, the self-evidently existing, ever more intuitively given world. In German, die selbstverständlich seiende, immerfort anschaulich vorgegebene Welt. This may sound puzzling, at least if one tacitly has identified the life world with the world of habits and interests, with the world of unquestioned meaning, in which everything is discovered under the self-evident conditions of practical human life, and because of this, itself has become self-evident. However, such is the world as it is described in Heidegger's Being and Time, and not in Husserl's Crisis book. The self-evidence Husserl refers to is not that of the everyday, but that of the authentic presence, in German Selbstgegenwart, the authentic presence of things, given in the primary originality, in German Uroriginalität, of perceptual intuition. Self-evident is the world of primary, or with another term of Husserl's, of primordial perceptibility. Such perceptibility is self-evident not because of habits and everyday routines, but because it cannot be doubted and also not be explained by any reduction to any reason. It is original, unquestionable, and not dependent on anything else. It's, in another word, it's the basis of realism. The life world is the self-evident aesthetic world, and human practices and activities do belong to this world only insofar as they are founded in passively having the world, passive Welthabe, in perceptual intuition. The life world is always there. No human activity would be possible without it. However, because meaning-based activities superpose the primary originality of perceptual intuition, the life world mostly remains inconspicuous, and rightly so, because otherwise the activities of everyday life could not be performed. However, human life in the world would remain unclear without specific endeavors to discover the authentic presence of life worldly givenness and make it explicit. Such is the original challenge of art. The aesthetic discovery of authentic presence should not be confused with a retrieval of something originally unconcealed and then for whatever reason concealed and forgotten, like Heidegger's being. The authentic presence of the life world is inconspicuous and discoverable at the same time, and accordingly its discovery will never totally overcome its concealment. Art and everyday practice coexist as two different kinds of experiencing the same world. Nevertheless, they are asymmetrical. Art presupposes everyday practice and also transcends it, performing an abstraction from the meaning-oriented attitude to the world in order to discover the world's primordial perceptibility. This move, again, is not a specific epistemic reference, but identical with the formation of artworks. The original presence of the life world is transformed into artworks and thereby brought to immediate accessibility. Artworks appear as self-contained entities. They do not mean or express something that could be clearly identified, but are what they are just in themselves. And being just in themselves, that way they appear objectively. One could object to such a characterization, if at all, one could object to such a characterization that, if at all, it could apply to modern art only, to artworks like abstract paintings or minimalist sculptures, though not to, for instance, traditional paintings which depict and signify something. However, also such paintings are not ascertainable as artworks by attempts to identify what they are supposed to represent. Also, for this artworks, or for such artworks, Frank Stella's famous sentence, "You see what you see," holds true. Even such attempts to find out what a traditional artwork would represent would have to refer to the colors, lines, and forms of a picture's appearance. It was Paul Valéry who brought forward this argument, and he did so in an essay not on modern painting, but on the art of Leonardo da Vinci. It is in reference to Leonardo that Valéry rejects the idea of taking pictures as depictions, and he also suggests an alternative method, which he calls the most safe one. Instead of recognizing something in a picture, one should step by step make a series of inductions that is necessitated by a simultaneous presence of colored spots in a limited field, and if at all, only then understand the picture metaphorically, that means as a depiction. Valéry's method allows for the fact that such presence of color constitutes a picture in its individuality, whereas something depicted could also be depicted otherwise. An insight that indeed holds true for traditional art, but prominently was discovered by modern artists. Valéry's method is best confirmed by painters such as Paul Cézanne, who describes the process of his landscape painting as enabled by the attempt not to identify anything visible while viewing a landscape, but instead to see meaningless colors. Painting, as practiced by Cézanne, would consist in translating such colors, seen by a painter whose mind is like a photographic plate, to the canvas. In doing so, a painter would allow a picture to become as objective as are the unstructured color spots of a landscape, viewed without any intention and any supposition of meaning. Painting, understood in this way, is abstract. It is an abstraction from meaning, even though a picture could be identified, for instance, as a depiction of the Montagne Sainte-Victoire. The abstraction, essentially to art, as it just was paradigmatically demonstrated with painting, has a surprising but striking parallel in science, as described by Husserl in his Crisis book, and especially in the famous addendum on the origin of geometry. As Husserl shows, geometry, and thereby also physics, as based on geometry, is an attempt to overcome the subjective and perspectival view on things in order to develop a system of impersonal and thus objective determinations. In his considerations on the origin of geometry, Husserl hypothetically reconstructs how such a system would be established. This is not a historical reconstruction, but rather an a priori explication of how the imagined inventor of geometry could have reached the idealizations that geometrical figures are. Husserl develops the invention of geometry as a sequence of abstractions. In a first step, the imagined founder of geometry took things as pure bodies, and not as meaningful things in whichever respect. Thereafter, the shapes of things like forms, like surfaces, lines, and angles were discovered and recognized as separate correlates of discovery. As soon as the invariant content of such forms was grasped, pure geometrical figures emerged and could become conceivable. Geometry, to sum up, starts with visible objects. However, these objects are not taken as visible, but regarded as invariant structures that can be distinguished from their visibility and be determined in mathematical definitions and calculations. According to Husserl's reconstruction, geometry and thereby geometrical science cannot be an integral part of everyday life. Rather, science abstracts from practical life and also, what is more important, from the life world as the world of original perceptible presence. However, taking such presence, and in particular visibility, as marginal, geometrical science lacks an idea of the very objects its calculations are applied to, and thus, as Husserl states, is hypothetical. Nevertheless, geometrical science is not a construction. It really works, and it does so efficiently, offering an objective determination of things that has become possible by abstraction only and could not have been established within the horizon of everyday practice. Reducing science to everyday practice would not make sense. Science is a project on its own terms, and cannot be reduced to anything else. However, despite its effectiveness, science does not cover the world in every respect. Science is incomplete insofar as the original presence it starts from and applies to cannot be scientifically grasped. However, it is not in need of an immanent completion, which could only be scientific, but needs a complement that as such withdraws from scientific explication. Such complement of science is art. Science and art disclose different kinds of objectivity. Because they are irreducible to each other, science and art together provide with a sufficiently complex prospect of what objectivity can be. Whereas scientific objectivity consists in determining something in accordance with a formal system, and thus objectively discovered the determined as a particular case of formal determinateness, artistic objectivity is that of something individual, which requires to be experienced in its very individuality. Accordingly, general aesthetical concepts can only provide a framework that cannot be applied to the particular, but should offer a general orientation for particular descriptions. However, not at least because of its individuality, the aesthetically objective needs philosophical interpretation. Aesthetic objectivity is by no means evident as to what it was suggested to be, namely intensified representation of the life world's original presence. Aesthetical experience is not isolated from every life worldly context. Rather, it may affect everyday perception so that things can be perceived more clearly after an experience of an artwork has been made. However, the essential connectedness of art and the life world is not per se clear, but has to be made philosophically explicit. The same holds true for the complementary relation of art and science. Aesthetic reflection that proves to be relevant for inhabiting a life world as well as for an understanding of science. Investigating such relevance more in detail would contribute to a conception of philosophical aesthetics that would restitute the systematic importance it has had in Kant's critical philosophy. Thank you very much for your attention. And I am now looking forward to your questions. And
thank you very much. Thank you very much. Since I have the privilege of be the uh, uh, maybe the oldest person between your ears, so that is just a privilege of age, a privilege. I would address you a consideration. Uh, I perfectly agree with the view that you are suggesting about the aesthetic experience. Um, on one is usually, for instance, think about the description of aesthetic experience in Adorno. The description of aesthetic experience in Adorno means that aesthetic experience is something which is rare and weakening in modernity. The more modern and technical and mediatic is a society, the less aesthetic experience is is present, is important, is relevant. There is a kind of degradation on middle brow, low brow, and popular art, etc. There is a sense in which I perfectly agree with Adorno, because think about all the discussion of aestheticization during the postmodern age. In this idea of aestheticization means that everything is an artwork, everything is fine also, but this simply because there was pop colors and for very good reason, because if you have to sell some commodity, it is interesting that this commodity looks well, fine, attractive, but this would not be that the whole range of experience became a range of aesthetic experience. But now there is something changed in our experience that fits more exactly to the type of experience you are describing, namely the fact that aesthetic experience is not necessarily related to the artwork, but is related to the Lebenswelt, world of life, and with the feeling of pleasure and displeasure. Classically, in the classical Kantian term, think about the web and the social network. What is the meaning of all this? Is say, documentation and reification of the life world that before was disappearing, because there was a kind of instability of Lebenswelt in the tradition, because the Lebenswelt was simply not recorded. Now, any form of life of humans in the Lebenswelt is recorded, elaborated by algorithms, and so on. This gigantic archive of the Lebenswelt, which is a novelty, which is extremely important also for the concept of Lebenswelt, because the typical attribute of Lebenswelt was that it was implicit. Whereas now, seemingly, the Lebenswelt can be also explicit. And what is the way in which this Lebenswelt express itself? In the aesthetic way, like or dislike. This is something which can be simply considered something accidental, but I believe that there is a necessity, because what is the way in which you can aggregate humans all over the world outside this like or dislike, which are exactly the categories used by Kant in order to define the aesthetical experience. What do you think, Günter, about this possible, say, implication of your discourse?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And that's it's a lot, and I will try at least to refer to some aspects of what you said. Let me start with Adorno. I think it's a kind of paradox in Adorno's aesthetical theory insofar as this conception of art, this philosophy of art, is very emphatically modern. In contrast to Heidegger or Gadamer, Adorno really is a partisan of modern art. But on the other hand, Adorno shares a view of modern art which is quite opposite in a certain way to his intention to be a partisan of modernity, because he agrees, for instance, with philosophers like Arnold Gehlen or with other very anti-modernist authors, insofar as Adorno also understands the history of modern art as a history of decline. And my suggestion is to regard this the other way around. And therefore, this parallel of science and art has become interesting to me. I always found it astonishing that in the age of expanding science, art established itself as an independent kind of discovering the world. Think of Paul Klee's famous dictum, I do not depict the visible, I make things visible. And so art understood in terms of Klee, or painting understood in terms of Klee, would be an original discovery of visibility. And this is the point I would like to stress, I would like to argue for. And I think the art I am referring to mainly in this context is art like Kandinsky, the tradition of Kandinsky and Klee, but also, which is very important to me, the American tradition of Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Agnes Martin, and then Donald Judd and others. So this means making visible. This is my first point. And the second point, I think we agree in our critical assessment of postmodernity or postmodernism. And as to this, I would like to introduce a distinction that the philosopher and art historian Gottfried Böhm has used, namely the distinction between strong pictures and weak pictures. There are many weak pictures in the world, but a canvas by Barnett Newman or Mark Rothko is a strong picture. And my reflections, which I presented, are meant to refer mostly to strong pictures. And if we take the existence of strong pictures are also strong pieces of music and so on serious, I think we have a good argument against such a generalization of an aesthetic view. Not everything is an artwork. Artworks are artworks, and other things are no artworks. They are something else, or there are bad pictures, or whatsoever. And so I think this year, the 100th birthday of Joseph Beuys, Beuys, who became famous for his sentence, "Every human being is an artist," but I take him ironically. I think one should not take everything serious that Beuys has said as if it were a dogma.
Also, because there was a strong difference between Beuys and a normal human. He was the empirical proof of the difference between an artist and a human.
Right. And your last point, Maurizio, the web. Yes, I agree with your description completely. And I would add that because of this documentary of life world, which you have discussed extensively in your recent book, because of this, we are in need of strong pictures and strong pieces of music and strong texts. We have so many weak pictures all over the world that we can only have a clear view on the visible if we also concentrate on strong pictures. And that's just a personal remark to add. I always, when I have visited a museum or so and contemplated strong pictures, it's like a day in nature. It's relaxing. It's really refreshing. And I think this is the general point. And so there is a lot of more work to do in order to clarify this relation between art and Lebenswelt. But I think this might be a first step. Was that an answer? Okay.
Thank you. This was, I perfectly agree with you, but I was not saying that there is, there is an aesthetic relevance of this judgment on the web, but they are aesthetic judgment.
Yes. Yes.
They are not political, not scientific. They are the form of the judgment, like, dislike, is aesthetic.
Okay. And if this is so, I agree. Then we could say that strong aesthetic judgments have become even more important because of this generalization.
Sure. I believe that Tiziana has, well, this is a pure inference since you are an expert.
No, I have a question, but Enrico Terrone asked to talk before me, so
excuse
first
me.
Enrico and then myself. Write in the chat, please, or
the virtual hand. I am not able to. I am unable to read, and I just can recognize images like hands or similar. Okay, Ron. So Enrico, Ron, Tiziana, could go.
Okay. Thanks for the talk. I have a question somehow connected to the last things you say in response to Maurizio. And it's about the scope of the proposal, because there seems to be works of art, even strong works of art, which do not fit with your proposal. Novels, literature, especially novels, the great novels by Balzac or Dostoevsky, are not perceptual in an interesting sense. They are perceptual in the sense that we should read the book, but in this sense also a book of philosophy is perceptual. So, but it would be weird to say that these are not works of art. They are not strong works of art. They are among the masterpieces together with the paintings that you mentioned. So I wonder whether it would be better to frame the proposal more as an account of certain forms of art, certain works of art, rather than an account of art in general. And I'm not even sure about music, because it doesn't seem to me that music reveals the life world in the way the paintings you mentioned do. If I listen to the Mozart symphony, I do not have the impression that this is revealing something about the sounds in everyday life. It seems to be a completely different kind of sounds rather than some implicit, tacit components of my ordinary auditory experience. So yes, I would like to hear a bit more on how your proposal can be extended from the works of visual art you mentioned to other forms of art. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I would like to start with music. My idea is not that music is necessarily an intensification of the sounds we hear every day, but that it is or would be an intensification of the audible. Nevertheless, sometimes there are these parallels between everyday sounds and music. I once read a remark by Luigi Nono, who said that the church bells of Venice inspired him for many of his pieces. And Helmut Lachenmann is a composer who works not only with musical sounds, but also with everyday sounds. Nevertheless, a symphony by Gustav Mahler is something else. But it intensifies listening. And insofar, I would say, as to music, it works. Texts, I agree with you. Texts, literary texts, are more a challenge, because what should a literary text be if not a complex of meaning? However, if we start with poetry, poetry is not primarily meaning, but is language as it sounds, and as it is composed in a way that the relation between the meaning of the words becomes complex and ambiguous. And I would suggest that as to novels, the description would have to be more elaborate, of course, but I would suggest that as to novels, we have the same situation, because it is very difficult to summarize a novel, or it is very easy. And if it's very easy, then you have not summarized the novel. So it's very easy to give a summary of Kafka's The Process. But what does it say? It doesn't say anything about the intense ambiguity of this text. And it doesn't say anything about how to read Kafka's Process, because there are so many readings and so many readings possible that it would be difficult to say what the meaning of Kafka's process is. And therefore, I would argue that the meaning of novels is embedded in a linguistic structure which is not primarily transporting meaning in such a way. And I would also, and this has become very important to me during recent years, I would also say that such considerations could be helpful for understanding artworks that are not esoteric in any way, namely buildings. I have just, if I'm allowed to say this, I have just completed a book which is called Aesthetics of Architecture. And in this book, I will argue that the primary or primordial experience of buildings is not that of their function, but it's aesthetic. And you can see this, for instance, if you consider different buildings that can have the same function. We have many art museums, for instance, many churches, which have the same function basically, but they are very different in their aesthetic experience. And I would argue that the aesthetic experience is what qualifies the function in a certain way. So these are ideas, but of course I agree. Literature it applies more obviously to music and to visual art, and I have concentrated in this paper on visual art because of this parallel to geometry. Geometry has to do with vision, and so. Thank you.
Thank you for the answer.
Thank you. Ron, please.
I have to apologize. I'm not a philosopher, though I know many philosophers. So I'm a little bit lost here. And I appreciate your paper, Günter, and thinking about it. If I may ask a question, then even if I'm lost, Maurizio raised, I think, an interesting question. The tradition of art in the 20th century, in the avant-garde and even in Heidegger, if one takes the term poiesis as the turning point in his work after the turn, so-called, the Kerl. The notion of art in the 20th century becomes that of poiesis, and that of the activity of making. And Maurizio points out this kind of interesting Hegelian turn, which you're turning postmodern, where the spirit of representation becomes represented to such a point that the specificity of art as poiesis becomes fetishized, and possibly the tokens of epistemic revelation, I think I hear you pointing to, Günter, disappear in a generalized phenomenology. that becomes known as aesthetics.
Thank you. I'm not sure, because I think I at least briefly touched upon your point, saying that art, as I would understand it, is not a kind of cognitive endeavor in order to discover visibility theoretically. But art, painting, discovers visibility in making it visible. And that means in producing visibility. So artists do not argue, artists produce. And
produce what?
Excuse me?
Produce what? I'm sorry. I'm just trying to understand everything you're saying. Produce what?
They produce artworks. And a painter, for instance, as I understand painting, a painter explores visibility in painting. And exploring visibility in painting establishes intense visible things. So I have the idea that one can combine this your considerations on on poiesis and the aesthetic approach to art.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tiziana?
Yes, I'm here. Okay. My question was is quite close, I think, to the Enrico question, because it's about your idea of or your preliminary division or between strong picture and weak picture. Because as you know, obviously, you mentioned philosophy of art at the very beginning of your talk, saying something about the distinction between aesthetics and philosophy of art, and you mentioned a particular line, okay, in philosophy of art, starting from Hegel, going through Gadamer and Adorno. But as you know, we have in the philosophy of art another line, which is the so to say Anglo-speaking English-speaking tradition line. That's with starting with Arthur Danto, Dickey, and the other guys who reflect about the ontology of the works of art. Okay, and that's another job, I think, that we can do regarding works of art in general. A different job compared to the aesthetics. Now, you have a distinction. You introduce a distinction between strong works of art and weak one, implying in this distinction a certain, I think, definition of art. So not everything you can include in your definition every possible object, I guess, but you consider certain works of art above the other, or most important than other. This is my first point. Is it correct? I'm understanding correctly, and if it is in this way, the consequence is that, for example, the works of art of the avant-garde, like Duchamp or other guys producing similar stuff, are something that you can read in the same way of the other more classical works of art, because it's very difficult to to conclude, to me at least, that the aesthetics can, that the ordinary aesthetics can say something about these works of art, or can introduce a way of reading that particular works of art. But if this is correct, your conclusion is that you have to exclude the avant-garde from your class of works of art in order to mix all together. I'm not sure that my questions are clear.
I will see. I try to answer, and if you do not agree with the answer, ask again, please.
Okay.
I do not, as you are completely right. First, I agree completely that philosophy of art, as I introduced it, only applies to the Hegelian tradition. So I had a kind of opposition between the Kantian tradition, which I call aesthetic, and the Hegelian tradition, and I would subsume Gadamer and Adorno is evident, but even Heidegger's essay on the origin of the work of art to a Hegelian position. And I see Nelson Goodman and Arthur Danto, and this is a different approach. And I would have to discuss in the next step how this idea of intensified perceptibility would work with conceptions like that of Goodman, for instance. As to Goodman, I would be quite optimistic. I think I could find several points in which his conception of languages of art or ways of world making is not alien to this obviously phenomenological aspect. I would have to think about it more in detail, but it should work. I hope so, at least. And the second point, I think I would not have to exclude the avant-garde. I would like to answer by pointing to what I call the aging of avant-garde. We are meanwhile in the situation that the music, for instance, that Adorno regarded as avant-garde, namely the New Vienna School, is no longer avant-garde. It has become classical music. Schönberg, Webern, and Berg are not so different from Mahler and Bruckner and so on. It's the same canon in a certain way. And perhaps the same has happened as to painting, for instance. And perhaps what could help as to this is an understanding of modernity, which is not based on an avant-garde idea of modernity, not on the idea of radical innovation and overcoming of tradition, but what I would call relaxed modernity. And relaxed modernity, in my view, is a kind of modernity that would pay more attention to the side by side of traditional and modern than of the contrast. So in concerts, meanwhile, it is not uncommon that an orchestra starts with a symphony by Mozart and then has a piece by György Ligeti to conclude with a symphony by Mahler or Bruckner. That works. It works side by side. And perhaps a brief remark to architecture. What really intrigues me as to contemporary architecture is that this idea of overcoming the tradition has been replaced by an idea of a dialogue between contemporary work and traditional works. I would like to mention two buildings which I find extremely impressive. The first is Peter Zumthor's Museum Columba in Cologne. It's a building that is partly erected on the walls of a Roman church, and it includes ancient Roman excavations. And the other building is the so-called James Simon Gallery in Berlin. It's the new entrance building of the Museum Island, Museumsinsel. And this is by David Chipperfield Architects. And this building, in a certain way, takes up the classical column or classicist column structure of the other museums, but transforms it in a way that you could no longer say this is classicism. So there is a dialogue between ancient or traditional architecture and such buildings. And as to Duchamp, I remember well an exposition in the National Museum of Tokyo with works by Duchamp combined with traditional Japanese ceramics. And that worked very well. So
I have an example, an argument to be added to this idea of compresence as typical of avant-garde. This is especially manifest in music, because there is a precise moment in music in the end of 19th century, yes, in which people, directors and operas decided to put programs in which you have contemporary artworks and traditional artworks. This was not the case at the epoch of Mozart. At the epoch of Mozart, the theater played Mozart, Salieri, or Haydn, but not Bach. The idea that you have a mixed program, including part of the tradition and part of the avant-garde, is a part of the logic of the avant-garde, because you have to put some traditional experience that ensures you a predictable reaction from the public, and something new that is not so evidently, this is interesting because it implies in the logic of the avant-garde the dialogue with the tradition. And this is a praxis, an evident praxis in operas that was standardized into the 20th century, namely in the epoch of the avant-garde.
Yes, thank you.
That's true.
I like that idea that on a historical level, a historic view and an avant-garde view complement each other in a certain way. It was in the age of Romanticism in music that Bach was rediscovered. It was Mendelssohn who first discovered Bach's music and performed it. What I have in mind as a second step or a further step is to suggest to regard this mixture more as a spatial than as a temporal relationship, and to say this is side by side and not overcoming or looking back. And perhaps that's a second step by to repeat what I would like to call relaxed modernity. A relaxed modernity, in my view, would be a modernity beyond the question history or presence, past or future, or tradition or avant-garde, but let's say both. And then this opposition weakens in a certain way. I like that.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
Davide raise his virtual hand.
Yeah, thank you. I have just a question. Thank you, Professor Figal, for your talk. I really appreciated it. I was wondering if there is a I'm really interested in your proposal concerning the connection between art and science, and in particular the role of abstraction. Just because in listening your talk, I was interested in particular. There was in my mind two strange references. From one hand, one was the remarks of Susan Langer concerning the connection between art and sciences, and in particular the role of abstraction. On the other hand, there was Jacques Derrida concerning the role of the criticism in phenomenology. Why? Because in a paper, in a very well popular paper of Derrida of 1967, entitled "The Form and the Meaning," if I correctly translate, the form and the way of saying something.
Forme e signification.
Yeah, of course. This is the correct title. Yeah, but there was this idea to connect form and presence, so to criticize the work in phenomenology, and in particular of Husserl and so on and so forth, as we well know. But the point is there in your account a room for form? Is possible to consider a development in your account concerning the role of form? Just because, for instance, according to Langer also, there was this occasion to investigate the connection between science and art, precisely investigating form, or on the other hand, in a strange way, I know, but according to Derrida, there was also this opportunity to connect form to presence and to investigate the role of form through the presence and the formal way of form through the presence. It seems to me something that is connected with your account that try to give relevance to the role of aesthetics and to the experience. And so, just
Thank you.
If there is a role for form. Yeah.
I think I could work with that. it depends on how you define form. Form is a very complex term, and Susanne Langer certainly understands form in terms of Cassirer, symbolic forms. And symbolic form is something, as I understand it, like a formatted or a produced self-contained entity of a certain quality. And as to this, I think one could, of course, call scientific conceptions formal, and could also call works of art formal. So that would be a first step in reconstructing or restating my argument in terms of Cassirer's philosophy and form and presence. Yes, absolutely, because if we take the term presence without dramatization, just in a down-to-earth way, I would say presence means repeated accessibility. And artworks are defined by repeated accessibility. I can again and again contemplate a picture, listen to a certain piece of music, or read a certain novel, and so on. And yeah.
No, thank you. That's because, if I may, there is this opportunity, because according to Langer, there was also a way to investigate the abstraction through the form. And this is something that also, it seems to me, naturally connected with your account.
Yes, absolutely.
And this was her idea to connect science with art.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that could work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Any other doubt, question, or comments?
If not, because no, because I believe that one of the advantage of this meeting on virtual way is that we can concentrate a lot of work in a limited space, but in the same time, I find them extremely heavy. I mean, I feel maybe because I am old, but I feel tired after all this logomachia on the web. But it depends. We are all tired, but all happy because of the relevant quality of this meeting that opens to us really new perspective, and we are all waiting for the development of your work and also on your work on architecture. Note that we have plenty of philosophers interested, architects interested in philosophy here in Turin. They are all waiting for your theories, so that when the book is ready, we will organize by sure an event here in Turin. So thank you very much again for coming here. Thank you for your presentation. Thank for your friendship and all the very best to you and to Antonia. See you soon.
Thank you very much. That was a really great pleasure to see you again and to discuss with you. And the discussion, I can only say, was very helpful, or has been very helpful for my work. This was a first a draft, so to say, of my project. And I have learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to further discussions. And I say grazie e arrivederci.
A
Thank
presto,
you.
ciao.
Arrivederci, grazie.
Bye.
Buonasera a tutti.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.